The barn had always been my escape from loneliness until one night when a simple moment with our horse took an unexpected turn and left me questioning everything I thought I knew about trust, boundaries, and my own desires. I know it sounds strange, but I have to admit it started innocently enough, or at least that's what I told myself at first. My husband was away on another business trip, and the house felt too quiet, too empty. Seeking comfort, I wandered out into the barn, as I had done so many times before. Apollo, our gorgeous chestnut gelding, had always been a calming presence, a source of peace in my otherwise routine life. But there was something different that evening, a change I couldn't quite explain, and in the silence of the barn, I crossed a line I never thought I would, one that blurred the boundaries of trust, loyalty, and who I thought I was. Our relationship, my husband's and mine, had always been one of routine, predictability, and comfort. He worked long hours at his corporate job, often traveling, and I stayed at home. We had built a life together filled with everyday moments, dinners, quiet weekends, long nights in front of the television. But something was missing beneath the surface. I couldn't put my finger on it, but over time the distance between us seemed to grow. And that's when I turned to our horse. We had always had horses on our property. It was a piece of land away from the hustle and bustle of the city, a place where we could breathe. The barn was well kept and the field stretched out like a quiet oasis. My husband loved the horses, and I could tell they brought him peace, but they never seemed to be more than a hobby to him. For me, however, the animals were a connection to something deeper, a way to escape the monotony of my everyday life. I would often visit the stable, feed the horses, and enjoy their company when my husband was away. That's how it began, you see, a relationship I never expected. I remember the first time I went into the barn alone while my husband was away on a business trip. The air was crisp and the smell of hay and earth filled my nostrils. There in the stall was a big, beautiful gelding called Apollo. He was magnificent, with a glossy chestnut coat that glowed in the afternoon sunlight streaming through the barn windows. His eyes were a deep, soulful brown that seemed to be watching me with curiosity. I had never been particularly close to him before. He had always been my husband's horse, after all. But that day I felt a strange pull towards him, an unexpected connection. I hesitated for a moment, standing by the stall door just watching him. He lowered his head, his nostrils flaring as he sniffed the air around me. Slowly, cautiously, I moved closer. "Hello," I said softly, my voice barely above a whisper. The words felt strange coming out of my mouth, but there was something about him that made me want to talk to him, as if he could understand. And for reasons I couldn't explain, I felt an instant trust from him. Apollo was his name, and he seemed to recognize the vulnerability in me as I recognized the same in him. In the days that followed, I began to spend more time in the barn. Whenever my husband was away, I would go and visit Apollo. I'd brush his coat, clean his hooves, and sometimes just sit beside him in the silence of the stable. I couldn't tell you why, but I began to feel a sense of peace when I was with him, an emotional release I had longed for in my own life. And so the days passed. My husband's journeys grew longer, and I found myself becoming more and more attached to Apollo. It was as if he understood my unspoken feelings. His presence brought me comfort, and when I rode him, it was like escaping into a world where nothing else mattered. The rhythmic movement of his gallop became my solace. The wind in my hair, the pounding of the hooves beneath me. It was like nothing I had ever known. But then, one day, something changed. It wasn't anything dramatic at first, just a quiet moment in the stable. I had spent the afternoon riding, and when I came back to unhitch him, something inside me told me to stay. I didn't want to leave him. I couldn't explain it, but there was a strange longing inside me that I couldn't push away. As I ran my hands over Apollo's smooth coat, I felt a surge of warmth, something beyond the simple bond we had formed over the past few weeks. Without thinking, I moved closer to him, my hands lingering longer than usual. He didn't pull away. In fact, he seemed to lean into my touch, his body responding to mine in a way I hadn't expected. It was subtle at first, a nudge, a shift in position, but I felt it, the energy between us, a quiet understanding. Then I knew. I know how strange it sounds, how impossible it must seem to anyone who hasn't been there. But I could feel Apollo's presence in every fibre of my being. It was as if he had become an extension of me, his thoughts and mine intertwined in some inexplicable way. It wasn't lust, not at first, but there was a tension, an undeniable charge that hung in the air whenever we were together. I tried to ignore it, to push it away, but it was always there. Every time my husband was away, I found myself drawn back to the barn, drawn to Apollo. The nights alone in the house grew colder, emptier. I would sit in the silence, listening to the wind outside, waiting for my husband to return. But even when he was home, the distance between us seemed to grow. I couldn't talk to him as I could to Apollo. He didn't understand my silences, my needs. But Apollo, he understood without a word. One night, after a particularly long day, I found myself back in the barn, unable to resist the pull. I had tried to ignore it, to focus on other things. But the pain in my chest grew unbearable. Apollo was waiting for me. I went straight to him. No hesitation now, no second thoughts. It was dark, the barn lit only by the soft glow of the moonlight filtering through the cracks in the walls. Apollo was there, standing patiently, as if he had been waiting for me all along. I could feel his gaze on me, steady and certain. For a moment, I just stood there, breathing in the night air, trying to calm my racing heart. And then it happened. I can't say exactly what made it happen, but as I reached out to touch Apollo's mane, something changed between us. The connection was no longer just emotional, it was deeper. And suddenly I realized I had crossed a line. I stepped back, my heart pounding in my chest. What was I doing? What had I just done? But the truth was, I didn't want to stop. I wasn't sure why, but at that moment I couldn't deny that Apollo and I shared something that defied explanation, something that had taken root in me and was impossible to ignore. It didn't end there. It wasn't a fleeting moment. It was the beginning of something I couldn't escape, something that grew. With each passing day, and as my husband continued to be away on business, I found myself returning to the barn. It wasn't confusion, it was a need, a deep, visceral need that grew with each visit to the stable. Apollo was no longer just a horse. He had become my secret, my escape, my obsession. His presence haunted me even when I wasn't with him. In the quiet moments of my day, when I was alone in the house, I'd think of him. The way his coat shimmered in the sunlight, the way his muscles rippled under his skin when he moved. I could almost feel his warmth, the way he responded to me. The connection between us was undeniable, like a magnet pulling me towards him no matter how hard I tried to resist. It wasn't just the physical closeness that drew me in, it was the silence. The space between us seemed to speak louder than words. Apollo didn't have to say anything to make me feel seen, understood, and wanted. He knew, he felt it. Every touch, every look we shared was enough to send a wave of heat through my body, and I couldn't stop it. No matter how many times I tried to tell myself that I was being ridiculous, that I was just lonely, that I needed to pull myself together, I kept coming back to the barn. It wasn't even that my husband was away. Yes, he was often away on business, but I still had my own life to live. I could have gone out with friends, I could have taken up hobbies or even gone back to work. But the truth was, I didn't want anyone else. I didn't want the company of people. I didn't want to fill the void with something that didn't matter. I wanted Apollo. That night, after everything had changed between us, I couldn't sleep. My husband had just returned from a week-long trip, and though I was glad to see him, there was a part of me that felt hollow. As he lay beside me in bed, his steady breathing only seemed to add to the chaos in my head. I couldn't concentrate. The rhythm of Apollo's movements, the warmth of his body, It all played in my mind like a film on repeat. I slipped out of bed, careful not to wake him, and found myself standing at the window, staring out at the barn in the distance. The moonlight bathed the field in a soft glow, and for a moment I felt torn between the life I had built with my husband and a strange new world I had begun to carve out with Apollo. I had been back from the barn for hours, but my body was still tingling, my skin still hummed with the memory of what had happened. Apollo's presence seemed to linger in the air, the bond between us pulsing with a rhythm all its own. I tried to push it away, but it wouldn't let me. There was no escaping it now. I walked back to the bed, my movements slow, as if in a trance. I could hear my husband breathing softly, his back to me, completely unaware of the storm brewing inside me. The silence between us was suffocating. I had always believed in the love we shared, but now it felt like something distant. The emotional void I had tried to ignore was becoming impossible to ignore. My husband was a good man. He didn't deserve this. But at that moment, I didn't care. The next day, I waited for my chance. My husband had plans to meet a colleague, leaving me alone again with only the sounds of the house and the fields outside for company. I don't know what made me do it. Perhaps it was the way Apollo's gaze burned into me whenever I was near him, or perhaps it was just the irresistible pull of a desire I had tried to bury for so long. But I didn't hesitate. As soon as I knew my husband was gone, I made my way to the barn. I moved quickly, as if something deep inside me knew that if I slowed down, I might stop. And I couldn't stop. Not now. I found Apollo waiting for me, as he always did. His fur was smooth, his muscles moving under his skin as he turned to face me. His eyes locked with mine, and I swear I could see the same longing in them that I felt in my chest. I didn't say anything. Words didn't seem necessary anymore. I walked towards him, my breath shallow, my heart pounding. My hands trembled as I reached for him, and when I touched his mane, a jolt of electricity shot through me. I couldn't explain it, but it was as if every nerve in my body was alive, every fibre of my being attuned to him. He nickered softly, as if inviting me closer, and I didn't hesitate. My hands roamed over his coat, the warmth of his body seeping into my fingers. My skin tingled with sensation. The world outside the barn seemed to fade away as I concentrated on him. I didn't know what was coming over me, but I didn't want to fight it. I didn't want to stop. I couldn't stop. The barn was silent except for the soft sound of Apollo's breathing, the rustle of his mane under my fingers. The tension between us was growing, palpable and thick. I moved closer, pressing my body against his side, feeling the heat emanating from him. His warmth seemed to seep into me and I couldn't pull away. I didn't want to. Apollo shifted, turning his head to nuzzle my neck, his breath warm against my skin. The sensation sent a wave of heat through me and I gasped, surprised at how it made me feel. I wanted more. Without thinking, I reached up to touch his face, my fingers brushing his lips. And then it happened. Apollo leaned in, his nostrils flaring, and I swear I could feel his heartbeat echoing against mine. For a moment, everything seemed to stand still. The world outside the barn ceased to exist. I don't know what happened next. I don't know where the line became blurred, but suddenly I wasn't just standing there. My body pressed closer to his, my hands moving in ways I couldn't explain. The feeling of his muscles under my touch made my breath catch in my throat, and I couldn't stop myself. I was lost in it, consumed by it. Every instinct in me screamed for more, for something I couldn't put into words. There was no turning back now, and then, as suddenly as it had begun, I realized what I had done. My chest heaving, my breath ragged. In the silence of the barn, the warmth of Apollo's body seemed to fill every inch of space around me, and I felt exposed, vulnerable. I pulled away, my heart pounding in my chest, my body shaking from the aftershocks of what had just happened. But I knew one thing for sure. There was no going back. The line I'd crossed wasn't just a physical one, it was a line in my heart, in my mind. A line that had been erased, and I didn't know how to find it again. I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. My body had responded to Apollo, the way his presence had flooded my senses. I tried to push it away, to tell myself it was just a fleeting moment of madness. But it wasn't. The connection between us had only deepened, and the harder I tried to ignore it, the more it consumed me. My husband had left, leaving me alone with my thoughts and with Apollo. He couldn't have known that even when he was home, I wasn't really there anymore. My mind was consumed with thoughts of that barn, Apollo's presence, his warmth, the way he made me feel in ways I couldn't describe. It was as if a part of me I didn't even know existed had awoken and I couldn't shut it out. The days felt like a blur, and every moment I wasn't with him, I longed for it. The feel of Apollo's breath on my skin, the warmth of his body pressed against mine. It was all I could think of. I began to visit the stable every day. Even when my husband was there, I'd make excuses, tell him I needed some fresh air or a walk or just a quiet moment to myself. I couldn't let him know the truth of what was happening inside me, and the truth was that I needed Apollo more than anything else. There was an attraction between us now, something undeniable. Every time I walked into that barn, I felt like I was stepping into a world where only Apollo and I existed. A world where the noise of the outside world, the expectations of my life, faded away. But this time, when I arrived at the barn, something felt different. Apollo wasn't in the stall where he usually stood, waiting for me with his gentle eyes. I called his name, my voice soft but full of urgency. He always answered when I called, but tonight there was silence. I felt a wave of panic rise in my chest. Had something happened to him? I rushed through the barn, opening the doors of each stall, hoping to find him. Finally, I heard him. His low whinnying echoed through the barn, and I followed the sound until I found him standing at the far end of the stable. He was just standing there, his head down as if deep in thought. When he saw me, his eyes lit up, and he trotted over to me, his hooves making a rhythmic sound on the hard floor. For a moment I stood frozen, watching him come closer. Then he reached me and nuzzled me gently. With his nose, as if to reassure me that all was well, I reached up to touch his mane, my hands trembling with the intensity of the emotions that were coursing through me. His warmth seemed to radiate through me, and I closed my eyes, just standing there, feeling the moment. But I wasn't just standing there. Something inside me was shifting again, a quiet desire and need that I couldn't push away. I let out a shaky breath as I gently stroked his neck, the muscle beneath my fingers rippling with every movement. The closeness between us was palpable, the air thick with unspoken understanding. It felt as if the space between us was closing, as if Apollo and I were becoming one in some way beyond the physical. I couldn't explain it, but in that moment it was as if we were connected on a level I had never felt before. The emotional bond between us had grown so deep that it was hard to tell where I ended and Apollo began. He seemed to respond to every thought, every feeling that passed through my mind, and I in turn became attuned to his every movement, his every breath. It was as if we were communicating without words, a silent understanding that grew stronger with each passing moment. I moved closer to him, my hand running down his side as I pressed my body against his. The warmth of his body seemed to melt away any lingering doubts or hesitations I had. There was no need for words. There was just us, just the silent bond that held us together. I had long since stopped asking myself why this was happening. There was no point in trying to understand it. Apollo shifted, moving so that his chest was gently pressed against mine, and I felt a strange rush of emotion wash over me. His breath was warm against my skin, and I closed my eyes, feeling the sensation spread through my body. My hands ran over his coat, the smoothness of his muscles under the skin sending a wave of warmth through me. I could feel my heart beating faster, the tension between us growing with each passing second. I had never felt so alive before. It wasn't just the physical closeness, though, that was undeniable. It was the emotional intensity, the feeling that I had found something that transcended the mundane. Apollo was no longer an animal to me. He was my equal. He understood me in a way no one else could, and in return, I understood him in a way no one else would ever be able to. His eyes locked with mine again, and I felt an electric current pass between us, the connection between us deepening in a way that was almost frightening. I could feel his warmth, his energy, his life force, and it felt as if I had merged with him. For a brief moment, I was no longer just me, I was us. I moved instinctively, my hands reaching for his mane, pulling him closer to me. His body responded, pressing against mine with a gentle force that made my heart race. Every inch of him seemed to burn with an intensity that mirrored my own desire. He was no longer just a presence beside me, he was part of me, and I was part of him. I couldn't deny the attraction any longer. The tension that had been quietly building between us over the past few weeks had finally come to a head. But just as quickly as the intensity flared, something inside me pulled back. I stood there, my body shaking, my breath shallow as I realized what I was doing. The guilt washed over me, a wave of shame that hit me like a cold bucket of water. What had I done? What had I become? I pulled away from Apollo, my heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't look at him for a moment. The guilt, the fear, the feeling that I had crossed an irreparable line overwhelmed me. I stumbled back, my hands shaking as I wiped my face, trying to clear the fog from my mind. I had no words, no explanation for what had happened between us. But in the silence, Apollo seemed to understand. He didn't move away from me. Instead, he stood there, watching me with those deep, knowing eyes, as if he could feel the storm raging inside me. I didn't know how to stop. I didn't know how to turn away from this strange, twisted connection that had formed between us. And I didn't know how to go back to the way things were, because no matter how hard I tried to convince myself that I could, I knew deep down that I was no longer the person I once was. I was someone else entirely, someone who had crossed a line that could never be crossed again. And the scariest part, I didn't know if I ever wanted to go back. I was spiraling, lost in a world I couldn't navigate. The attraction between me and Apollo was undeniable, but it came with a darkness I couldn't escape. It was as if I had willingly entered a maze with no exit, no way to undo what I had allowed to happen. And the worst part was that every part of me, every part of my body, my mind, my soul, was desperately pulling me back, deeper into that maze, deeper into Apollo's orbit. The guilt was overwhelming at times. But there were other times, moments when Apollo was close to me, when he nuzzled my neck or brushed against me with his soft, warm body, when the guilt faded. It seemed insignificant compared to the magnetic pull that now existed between us. When he was near, I wasn't reminded of the life I'd left behind, the promises I'd made, the vows I'd taken. When I was with him, everything seemed to make sense in a way that the world around me never could. There was no noise, no judgment, just us. But the tension was building. I could feel it in my bones. It wasn't just the growing closeness between Apollo and me, it was the realization that I couldn't live in this secret world forever. There were days when I was caught between the need to keep pretending that everything was normal and the urge to abandon that false reality altogether. The facade I had built with my husband was becoming more fragile by the day. I had managed to keep up appearances for a while, lying to myself and lying to him. When he returned from his travels, I pretended everything was fine, but I knew he had begun to notice something in my eyes, a change that couldn't be hidden any longer. I couldn't hide the way my body seemed to hum with energy whenever I was near Apollo, the way I drifted off, lost in thoughts that had nothing to do with my husband. One evening, my husband came to me with a serious expression on his face. He hadn't spoken for days, watching me out of the corner of his eye with a look I couldn't read. The questions hung in the air between us like a thick fog, suffocating everything. He leaned against the doorframe, his eyes searching mine. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice low but filled with an unsettling calm. I swallowed hard, my stomach twisting into knots. I had no idea how to respond. Part of me wanted to confess everything, the truth I had been hiding, the secret world I had built with Apollo, just as I had betrayed him, but another part of me couldn't bring myself to shatter the illusion. "I don't know what you mean," I said, my voice sounding far more distant than I intended. I cursed myself for the way my heart was racing, the way my hands were trembling. He studied me for a long moment before moving away from the doorframe. His gaze didn't leave me as he came closer, his voice softer now, tinged with concern. "I gave you space because I thought you needed it. But this isn't you. You've been different." I had no answer. I felt like a stranger to myself, disconnected from the life I once knew. The woman I used to be, the part of me that had once been his wife, seemed to have faded away, lost in a world that no longer fit. "I've been fine," I finally said, forcing the words out even though they felt like lies. "Just a bit stressed." But he wasn't convinced. He watched me for another moment, and then, almost as if he had made a decision, he turned and left the room without another word. The silence that followed was deafening. I heard him downstairs, pacing the kitchen, and I knew he was trying to figure it out, trying to put together the pieces of a puzzle he couldn't quite solve. I wanted to leave. I wanted to escape, to run to the barn, to be with Apollo where nothing mattered but the warmth of his body and the silence between us. But I couldn't. Not yet. The days grew colder, and I found myself withdrawing further into myself. I stopped pretending. I stopped fighting it. The pull to Apollo was now all-consuming. It became impossible to function without him. And then it happened. It was late in the afternoon, my husband had left for a meeting, and I was heading back to the barn. I knew what I was doing, I knew the consequences, but there was no turning back. Apollo greeted me as he always did, and I found myself staring into his deep brown eyes, unable to look away. The bond between us seemed to shimmer in the air. I could feel his energy, his presence, his quiet strength surrounding me. I walked towards him, my hands trembling as I reached out to touch his mane. But something was different this time. This time there was an intensity in the air, a knowing between us that hadn't been there before. As I ran my fingers through his mane, I felt the tension in my body release, the rush of desire wash over me. My mind couldn't process it anymore, the thoughts too chaotic, the emotions too raw. Suddenly I heard a noise, footsteps. My heart stopped and a wave of panic swept through me. I pulled away quickly, my breath coming in short gasps as I looked around the barn. But it wasn't the sound of my husband. It was something else, something that made me freeze. Apollo's eyes were wide, his body tense, but the silent connection between us didn't break. It was as if time had stood still, the world waiting, holding its breath. And then I heard it, the sound of the barn door creaking open. My husband's unmistakable voice. He was home early. My blood ran cold. I had been captured, not physically, but emotionally. There was no turning back from that moment. I stood frozen, not knowing what to do next. My heart pounded in my chest as I heard him approach the barn, each step echoing in my mind like a countdown. There was no more pretending, no more hiding behind lies. I could feel the weight of the truth settling around me, the consequences of my actions finally catching up with me. When my husband walked into the barn, I didn't look at him. I couldn't. He stood in the doorway, silent for a long moment. And then I heard him speak. "I knew something was wrong," he said, his voice low but steady. "I didn't want to believe it, but now I understand." I turned to him, my heart heavy with shame. The man I had promised myself to, the man I had once loved with everything I had, was standing there, and I had betrayed him in the worst possible way. "I never meant for this to happen," I whispered, the words barely escaping my lips. "But it happened." He didn't answer. He didn't need to. The pain in his eyes told me all I needed to know. There was no easy way to fix what was broken. There was no way to erase what had happened between Apollo and me. History had come to its tragic, irreversible end, and there was no way to undo the damage I had done. My world had shifted, twisted and broken in ways I couldn't comprehend. And in that moment, as the silence stretched between us, I realized that no matter what came next, there was no going back to what I had once known. Everything had changed.